All right. Today we are going to learn about intermediate JavaScript. We're going to talk about why JavaScript is such an important language for the web and programming in general, and do a pretty deep dive into JavaScript language fundamentals. Um, Language fundamentals are things like the syntax of a programming language, what are called logical operators to say if or else, or Boolean logic, if X is true and Y is false, what are called primitive data types, like numbers, sometimes strings, true or false values, what are called more complex data types. JavaScript arrays and objects are examples of complex data types. We'll talk a little bit about what makes JavaScript a dynamic language. I can change the value of a variable. When I create a variable, it is not stuck to always be the same type. X can be an integer or a string. Not every programming language is like this. And we'll see how to run JavaScript code. Before we dive too deep into this, I do have a fun little video for us to watch that's a super condensed history of JavaScript. And let me cue this up and we will dive right on in.
JavaScript, an embarrassing toy language used exclusively to build things it's not supposed to. It was created by Brendan Eich in 1995, who was given requirements to build a language like Java, but for it only took him 7 days to execute flawlessly. It became an overnight dumpster fire, but shit really hit the fan in 2005 when Ryan Dahl made the epic mistake of bringing JavaScript to the server with Node.js. Just like Alfred Nobel and Dynamite, he would go on to apologize for his invention many years later.
And it's my fault, and I'm very sorry.
The language is designed for only one use case, to annoy people with browser pop-ups. But today, it's used to build memory-hogging desktop apps with Electron, janky mobile apps with React Native, and unreliable APIs with Express.js. No matter what you're trying to build, there are hundreds of different game-changing next-gen libraries to get the job done. That's because whenever a JavaScript developer encounters a problem, it will instinctively create a brand new framework and upload it to GitHub with a bunch of emojis in the README. In fact, there are so many NPM packages that Al Gore is now predicting the Arctic will be ice-free by 2013.
You have stolen my dreams, my childhood.
Unlike languages people actually like, JavaScript doesn't have a mascot, but they are working with David Cronenberg to design one. It's a loosely typed language, and by that, I mean completely detached from reality. When you add an array to an object, obviously it returns a string that says object. Now switch the order of the operands, and predictably it returns 0. If you want to get laugh for yourself, try adding two objects together. You'll get object. Now with that knowledge, what do you think two arrays will equal? Obviously an empty string. That makes total sense because the number 0 is equivalent to an empty array, and also equivalent to a string of 0. And that means the only possible same conclusion is that a string of 0 is also equivalent to an empty array. But amazingly, it's not.
Everybody knows you never go full retard.
It got this way because Netscape did a focus group in the 90s with some homeless web developers they found on the street who thought 2 plus 2 should equal 22. And of course, that's why 2 minus 2 equals 0. When a language is this bad and it's popular at the same time, it creates an ecosystem where libraries like is-odd, which does exactly what the name implies, can get over 400,000 downloads per week. The fun thing about packages is that there's multiple module systems like CommonJS and ESM, so you never know if the package you're installing is actually going to work. Now, if you do manage to build something with JavaScript, it'll probably never see the light of day because then you have to learn module bundling with a tool like Webpack, and it's just not worth it, man. This has been my cathartic release from over 10 years of JavaScript development. Despite its problems, it's evolved into an awesome language in 2022, and I love programming with it. Today is Thanksgiving, and I'm extremely thankful for JavaScript because it puts food on my family. If you want to master the basics, all this reverse psychology should motivate you to buy my JavaScript course, and if you don't buy it, I won't make any money. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one, assuming I'm not entirely canceled after this video.
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on.
And now we have the ads for AI. So credit where credit is due. JavaScript for the Haters is an amazing video. For anyone who has worked with JavaScript before, you may be getting flashbacks from watching that. I've worked with JavaScript a long time. I love it. I also think I have a bit of Stockholm syndrome. It is simultaneously the most popular programming language in the world, the most widely used language in the world. It is literally the programming language of the internet. It does some things really well, and it also does some things really poorly. So let's talk a little bit about why JavaScript is so important. So the way the internet works is we have computers, and in programming, when we're making web apps, we call these things clients. And it might be my laptop, right? It might be my phone. It could be a desktop. And then over a network, and we call this one big network the internet, the client talks to another computer. And this computer we call the server because it serves or sends information back to the client, right? And sometimes it might send back a website in HTML. Sometimes it might send back data. And often this data is in a format called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and is very similar in organization to JavaScript. And JavaScript, when it was first designed, ran on these clients and it ran in the browser. It was really the first real programming language to run in the browser. And if we open up in our browser what's called the inspector, which can do a lot of exciting things. Right now, it is showing me, it's simulating what our curriculum looks like in a mobile browser, which is not what I want at the moment. We can see all the HTML on a page. We're now in what's called developer tools, which we'll learn about later in the course. But we want to go here to what's called the JavaScript console. And I can actually run JavaScript code in here. And while this is getting more advanced, I can interact with the HTML on my page using this JavaScript. Though that's a little out of scope for right now. But we could actually interact and change the values of these different elements. And so this is really why JavaScript is the language of the web. And while if we're making a website like Wikipedia or a curriculum website that mostly displays static or unchanging information, we might not need lots of fancy interactivity. If we're building Google Maps, we need so much interactivity, right? This is not a web page at this point. This is a full-on program that just happens to be running in my browser. And the language that this Google Maps program is written in is JavaScript, right? And whenever I'm clicking on something here, my browser is talking to a Google server somewhere in the cloud over the internet, and the server is sending back all this information about different restaurants and things like that, and it's JavaScript code that's powering all of that. So that's kind of JavaScript's origin story and a big part of why it became so popular. What has happened over time is because the language was so widely used, people decided it would be really nice to be able to run JavaScript not just on the client, but also on the server. What if I can have my web server be in JavaScript instead of Python or Ruby? And then all the programmers on my team just need to know one programming language. So somewhere in the 2010s, a library called Node.js was created to do exactly this. And so now if I have a JavaScript file, and I have one here named part1 for part 1 of this lecture, .js, and I put some JavaScript code in here, hello world. On my command line, I can use Node.js to run that JavaScript code. And it will execute it, and this is now running on my computer. And this has been with us for a while now, but in the early days of the internet, this was impossible. JavaScript only ran in the browser. But now that we can run JavaScript both in the browser and on the server, it's become a really powerful language. And while like every programming language and every tool has its pros and cons, it's not going anywhere. So that's sort of an overview and an introduction to the history of JavaScript. And you know, the video was a little ridiculous, but also a little bit true. And part of the challenge is when a language is so popular and widely used, it just has more challenges to tackle than other languages. So in today's lesson, the first part will cover the JavaScript language fundamentals. We'll learn about data types, writing functions, Boolean or ternary logic, and making loops. Following, there will be a part 2 lecture where we'll go deeper into JavaScript. We'll see some more modern JavaScript features like arrow functions. We'll see some of the challenges of the language, like what it considers true or false. We'll see some more advanced tools for iterating and writing code in a bit more of a functional programming style, and what's called some syntactic sugar, where when you're writing lots of code all the time, it's an easier way to do certain common tasks with objects and lists. Then later in part 3, we're going to learn a bit more about the JavaScript ecosystem. We're going to learn about testing and the idea of test-driven development, the Jest framework that is for writing tests, how to set up a project in JavaScript and write tests and do some exporting and importing. So I just want to pause and see if folks have any questions before we dive on in. All right, awesome. Oh, Alex, yes, sir.
Where can I find this README?
It's in the curriculum repository. Oh, this one, my apologies. This one, we have a demos and notes repo, and it will go in there at the end of the lesson.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, totally. It also covers the same ground though as what's in the curriculum repository. So one thing I want to point out before we get too deep, and let me open up a second terminal session here, or shell session, is if I just type node all by itself and hit enter, this gives me something really similar to the JavaScript console in the browser, where I can write and run JavaScript one line at a time. And this can be really useful for sort of testing as you go. So I often will have multiple shell sessions here open in VS Code, and I'll write most of my code in here and run it on the command line like we saw just here. So to execute a JavaScript file, right, I do node and then the name of the file I want to run. But I'll often also have the Node.js REPL or read evaluate print loop open in another shell. And as you all write more code, I recommend getting into this habit because sometimes you just want to test something out real quick. Like, does 5 equal 5? Or does 5 double equal 5? And this is a little bit of a preview of something we're going to get to later and is one of JavaScript's big gotchas. So it can be really useful. For most of the code in this lesson, I'll type it here and run it though. So let's talk about variables. There's a couple of different ways to write variables in JavaScript. And let me give us a little more screen real estate here. I think that ought to do it. So we have let x equals 5, and I'm declaring this variable, and what's over here on the right side of the equal sign gets assigned to the value on the left. And I can print that out. And I can change the value of x. I don't need to use let again once I've declared it. Because JavaScript is a dynamic language, I can change not only the value of a variable, but its type. I'm not only changing x from the value of the number 5, I'm changing the type of the variable x from a number to a string. Not every programming language can do that. Programming languages that can are called dynamic languages. And if we run our code, we see both of these things printed out. So this is the most common way of declaring variables. You'll also see another way of declaring a variable called const. This is short for constant. What's special about a const is once you've declared or created the variable, you can't change its value. And I'm going to get an error now when I run this code because JavaScript won't let me change the value of that const or constant variable y. Right? And we see this type error, assignment to constant variable, meaning I try to assign a value to this variable y, but because y is a const, I'm not allowed to. So a good rule of thumb is start with const, and then if you find that you need to change the value, change it to let. It puts a little more work up front, but you'll find it makes your life easier in the long run, and helps you keep track of things easier. Now, there are some other ways to declare variables. You should never do these. These are from the early days of JavaScript. Declaring a variable without using let or const, or there is a keyword var, and all of this will work, but it is a really bad practice to do it. And if you ever submitted code to an interview or on the job that declared a variable in either of these ways, it would be perceived very negatively. And let me comment out our const declaration here so that we can see this other code run. Right? And this works just fine, but we don't want to do it. The reason we don't want to do it is because these variables live in what's called the global scope, meaning they can exist in places they shouldn't be. And as programs get really big, this can cause a lot of problems. We'll talk a little bit more about scope later, but the main takeaway is this is a very, very old way of writing JavaScript, and no one does this anymore. And just because it doesn't produce an error doesn't mean you should do it. Bryson, yes, sir.
Yeah, it's kind of off topic, but how are you able to comment out like multiple lines at a time?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So in VS Code, if I do control /, it will comment out a line, and I can toggle that. Or on a Mac, it's command /. I'm using something called Vim mode that lets me highlight multiple lines. But if you guys do this with the mouse, or there are other keyboard shortcuts for highlighting multiple lines. Once you have multiple lines highlighted, you can comment them all out. And
Sweet,
actually,
thank you.
let me go ahead. Yeah, great question. All right, let's talk about functions. And note, by the way, that this comment was incorrect because of these red squigglies and this red line here. And if I run my code right now, we'll see an error. We see a syntax error, meaning I did not write this code in the format that it needs to be interpreted and run correctly. When I'm making a multi-line comment, it needs to start with a slash and 2 stars and end with 2 stars and a slash. So I can make a multi-line comment like this. And I can also make a single line comment with just 2 slashes. So, functions. Let's write a function that takes a first name and a last name and returns a full name, putting both of those names together. I use the function keyword, and then I give the name of the function I want to declare. Now, I need to have this open and close parentheses in my function argument, and then I need what's called a block, which is the space between these two curly brackets. And we're going to build this function out and make it real in just a minute. But right now, I just want to walk through the syntax of a function. So I've now declared this function. If I want to run it, I need to use the function name, and the 2 opening and closing parentheses are how you execute or call a function. And so now we see this is a function running. And JavaScript is a little weird. You can actually declare a function after you use it. Python and other languages don't work this way. This is called function hoisting. When the JavaScript interpreter or runtime reads this code, it looks for the function keyword and loads all these into memory first before doing anything else. And this is pretty common, so this is perfectly okay to do because it can help organize code. So we have this function. Let's go ahead though. Let's pass some arguments into my function. You'll hear these called arguments or parameters. And these are basically temporary variables that get created inside the function. And JavaScript is interesting in that I don't necessarily have to pass a value in. If I run my code, we see this value undefined, which means, and we'll talk about undefined a bit more later, that although this variable was created, it does not have a value, right? So we ran this function here. It creates this temporary variable, but it doesn't have a value. The way to pass in a value for an argument is when we call the function to do so like this. And now if I run my code, we'll see that that first name parameter or argument has a value. And I can go ahead and I can have as many arguments as I want in a function. And now if I run this code, I'll see both of these printed out, right? You can combine strings with the plus symbol. This is called concatenation. So let's combine the first name with a space and then the last name. And let's run the code. And now we have our logic, right, to construct a full name. But what I really want is I want my function to return that value. And I'm going to go ahead and remove those comments. It's really helpful to use console logs when you're developing code to help see the flow of execution, and then you can comment them out or delete them when you're done. And so now I run my code, but note that we don't see anything printed. This function is called and it returns this value here, but nothing is being done with this value. It's going into the void, so to speak. So I need a variable to hold that value that's returned. So I'll just create a const variable. And now let's console log, let's print out that my name variable. And we can now see that name printed out. And the nice thing about this function is it only does one thing, right? This function's job is not to print the name, it's to construct the full name and return that value to whatever is here on the left side of the equal sign. And then it's something else's job, another parts of the code job to print it out. And this is a programming principle called separation of concerns. So try to write functions that just do one thing, and then you can compose these little functions into bigger, more complex logic. I don't necessarily need a variable to print this out. This returns this value to whatever's capturing it. So another way to do this would be console.log, and then inside here to call the function and just print it out without even assigning it to a variable, because this returns this value and it gets captured by this print statement. So when JavaScript is reading this code, it gets here to line 31 and it says, oh, I'm supposed to print something. But wait, I don't know what I'm supposed to print. Oh, I need to call this function and pass in these arguments. Let me execute this code and do this logic here, construct this full name, return that, and then that value is passed to the console log statement, which prints it out. Arnold, yes, sir.
Yeah, so I noticed that you put the console log before the function. That doesn't matter.
In
Before or after you
JavaScript,
put.
it does not.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can, functions are special. You can't do that with variables. A function you can declare anywhere.
Well, what was it called again? Function hoisting?
Yeah, it's called hoisting, is in like lifting something to the top. Basically, before this code is run, JavaScript looks for all the functions, grabs them, and brings them to the top of the file.
And
And I don't think there's a particular right or wrong. That was simply a design decision that was made when the language was created. And the story goes that it was a programmer at Netscape, this guy, Brendan Eich, and he created the language in about 2 weeks, which I think explains some of its strengths and weaknesses. Tony, yes, sir. And then I do want to move on.
Does it matter how you declare the function? Like if you put let function, would that cause any problems with the hoisting, or is it specifically just with function?
Great question. With the hoisting, you need to declare the function like this, where it's function and then function name. You do touch on a good point. There are other ways of creating functions. I could do something like this. Where I'm creating and declaring a function, but I don't give the function a name. I actually assign the function to a variable, and a variable is just a container. It can hold anything, right? And in this case, it holds a function. This is a little more advanced, but let's do console.log, say hello, and let's say hello to Brendan Eich who created JavaScript. We will see this more later with arrow functions. I don't want to go too deep into it right now. When you're using the function keyword, you almost always want to give it a name and what's called a named function. So do it this way and not this way, and we'll see why later. Yeah, good question. All right, let's talk a little bit about data types. And we're going to talk about primitive data types. So as it mentions over here, things like strings, booleans, a boolean value is true or false. My apologies, I keep losing the preview when I click on it. Undefined, which is actually a value, null, which we'll talk about in a minute, are all primitive data types. So let's look at strings first. I can have a string in single quotes, but if I then want to use special characters, like say a single quote as part of the string, it's going to break the syntax as these red squigglies show us. In which case, I just want to use double quotes instead of single quotes, and we will be good to go. So if in doubt, just use double quotes when creating strings. And we can go ahead and obviously we can print this out. There's a couple ways of combining strings. We've seen one here called concatenation, where we add them together. There's another way called interpolation. And let's actually rewrite our full name function to see it in action. So let's make a function and let's call it make full name version 2 with a first name and a last name. And let's actually call this greeter, and let's have it do a greeting message. and it's going to return a string. To do string interpolation, I use the backtick symbol, that's just to the left of the 1. And I can put text in here just like a string. But then when I want to use a variable inside of this, I use a $sign and a curly quote. And I can construct more complex strings this way. Right? And so now my greeter function is going to say, hello, Ken Ritchie. It's a beautiful day. So again, this is string interpolation. This is really useful. It's with the backtick, the $sign, and the curly quote. I do recommend using this pretty much all the time to get in the habit of it and get used to it, especially as your logic gets more complex and makes life easier. I'm just going to take a quick moment here to comment out some of these console logs before we move on. All right, let's talk about numbers. So in JavaScript, there's only one kind of number. And it's basically of type number. And let's just print these out. And if I want to print out multiple things, I can use the comma. And so we see these numbers printed out. Let's throw a string in here just for as a point of comparison. And instead of printing out the values, let's use JavaScript's type of operator. So this is built into the JavaScript language. So this is going to return the type of variable that my int is and the type of variable that my decimal is and the type of variable that hello is. And we see here that this returns, it probably just returns a string representing the type of variable, that both of these are numbers. And then the third one is a string. Some programming languages have a different type for integers, right? Integers are like 0, whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, negative numbers, -5, -10. Integers is basically anything that's not a decimal like we have here, right? JavaScript does have some other number types floating around, but 99.9% of the time, we just use the number type and it can handle both integers and decimals. And so here we've got strings, right? And we see the string type. Let's look at the Boolean type, which is either a value true or false for helping to write logic. And just for fun, we'll change it from true to false just so we can see this in action. And if we run this, we should see type Boolean show up. Let's create a variable that has an empty value. So this is a special keyword, null. It means no value. This is not 0, right? 0 is actually a number. Null is when we want to indicate that on purpose, this variable does not have a value. And my console log is getting a little long. I'm going to refactor the way it's written just a little bit. JavaScript does not care about new lines. It pays attention to semicolons to tell when a line of code is done. So you'll often see JavaScript written in this way if you're calling a function, which we are here. We're calling the built-in console.log function as you start to add more stuff. And if we run this code now, we see very interestingly that although the value of this variable is null, its type is object. And we'll talk a little bit more about objects in a bit when we get to complex data types. But this is sort of a preview into what can make JavaScript a little more complex. So the value of this is null, right? And in fact, let's just console log, this is null. And let's use some string interpolation. Its value is null, but in JavaScript, null is actually under the hood an object. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And I want to show just one more variable type, and then I'll pause for questions. So the last variable type I want to show is undefined. And this is very simple. We can declare a variable, but not give it a value. And this is kind of like having, a glass that's completely empty, right? Null is actually a value, as weird as it sounds. It's like, if you have a glass and it's filled with air, well, there's still something in there. Undefined, it's like there actually is no value. And so we need a separate term for that. And let's go ahead and print this out. And forgive me for some typos there. As you saw, VS Code gives you some nice autocomplete help. If it shows up, I think you should take advantage of it. At the same time, no matter how fancy AI is, programming is still a lot of typing and checking for typos and stuff. So I think typing everything out by hand is a really important part of the learning process. So let's check out both the value and type of our new this is undefined variable. And again, we see something really interesting here. The value is undefined, right? And in fact, the type is undefined. So undefined is the type. Null under the hood is actually an object. And I believe there was a question. Alex, yes, sir.
I don't know if this is my like Python brain, but I'm guessing numbers and integers are interchangeable, and I guess like the words. And does float not exist in JavaScript?
In JavaScript, you pretty much use the number type for all numbers. There are one or two others, but they're really only used for special cases, and the number type handles integers and floats.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, good question. AJ, yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay. So I mostly touched Python prior to coming here, so JavaScript's new for me. Like I didn't even know that you were putting comments in with that until you mentioned it later.
Mhm.
Because I'm just used to using the number sign, writing whatever I want in Python. So I'm just curious at with the extent all that console log is doing and why it's not just a comment to start from. Like, what is it actually doing to the system?
You mean what's happening with when this console log statement on line 62 gets run?
Just printing like in Python or
Got it. Yeah, great point. Great point. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. This is a print statement. And my apologies for not mentioning this earlier. In Python, we would see, something like this. In JavaScript, it doesn't have a print statement. It has this console.log. We'll talk about what the dot is doing a little bit later. Under the hood, what's going on is this is actually an object, and this is a function that lives on this object. So log is sort of shorthand for print. And this is the standard way to print stuff in JavaScript.
okay. I thought it was print, but I didn't want to get assumptions because that's how you can get really messed up later.
100%. No, that was a good call. And thank you for asking. I should have clarified that too. Bryson, yes, sir. And then I do want to move on.
Yeah, real quick, how do you know when to use the semicolons? Like when are you supposed to break up the code?
Yeah, that's a great question. You should probably use the semicolons all the time at the end of every line. It used to be in JavaScript, you really had to do this. It's like supposed to be here. You declare a variable, you do this. When you have the curly brackets, as you'll note for this function statement, is when you don't need them. Modern JavaScript has gotten a lot smarter and better able to figure stuff out. Back in the day, not adding a semicolon potentially opened the door for all sorts of errors. So on a practical level, you can get away with the not using semicolons. I would probably recommend putting a semicolon at the end of every line there. And let me follow up to make sure that's current best practice. But the short answer is if you've got curly brackets, you don't need a semicolon here with a block, but everything else does. And I'll try to be more consistent about that as we go on, like there should be one here as well. Yeah, good question. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit more about Booleans, and then we'll take a break. So we've seen that Booleans are true or false, right? Oh, and actually, my apologies. I do want to mention before we move on to Booleans, JavaScript has a bunch of standard functions for working with numbers. We're going to use this built-in math class. So for instance, if I want to square a number, if I want to square 3 and raise it to the second power to get 9, I would use math.pow. And down here we have 9. And similarly, if say I had a decimal value, and this is important because this actually comes up fairly often. If I have like 5.33 and I just want to round it down, I would use what's called the floor function. And you can look up this math class either on the Mozilla Developer Network, the MDN docs, or W3 schools, and you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different math functions. And let's actually just take a quick look at both of those, because those are good resources to know. So MDN, or Mozilla Developer Network, these are the folks who create the Firefox browser. They have pretty much what's the gold standard for documenting JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. As you can see, it's pretty comprehensive and it's a bit complex, but everything you want to know will be here. You have like actual interactive code you can play with and run to test stuff out. Another good resource is W3 schools. I think this is a bit of an easier starting point. as you get deeper into JavaScript, you will find sometimes that it doesn't go quite as deep as you need. The other one is Geeks for Geeks, which is quite good. I think W3 schools is probably, if you feel like the language is newer, start here. As you start getting more comfortable, try to shift over to MDN. And MDN is, again, sort of like the gold standard. All right, let's talk about Booleans. Give me just one sec here to comment out some of my console logs. And that ought to be good enough. So, Booleans are interesting. Booleans kind of go along with what's called conditional logic, as in the different kind of conditions. These two vertical pipes that we see are what's called a logical OR statement. And what happens is JavaScript looks at the one on the left, evaluates if it's true or false. If it's true, it calls it a day and it's done. If it's false, it moves on. So this is going to give us true. This should also give us true. And let's run it and make sure that I'm correct and I'm not confused. And indeed, we see that both of these are true. And what's happening here is JavaScript is looking at this and says, hey, is this true or true? Is this false or true? And so if this first statement here evaluates to true, JavaScript pretty much calls it a day because we don't need both of these to be true. We only need one. But if this first statement here evaluates to false, it goes and it looks at the next one. And this is what's called short circuiting, right? It only looks at as much as what it needs to. For what's called an AND statement in JavaScript, it's a little different. For AND, we need both of the values to be true. And the AND symbol we use 2 ampersands for. So this is going to be true. This is going to be false. Excuse me. This is also going to be false. And then finally, if both the values are false in an AND statement, that is also going to be false. Right? So this is saying, is this or this true? Is this or this true? And then it returns true or false based on that. Right? And if we did this would return false because neither are true. But with and, they both have to be true. And JavaScript is checking and saying, hey, is this and this true? If it is, return true. Is this and this true? If it is, return true. If not, return false. And so if we run this, we see here, and why don't I add, well, we'll just kind of walk through from the bottom up with false and false. We see it's indeed false, right? They're both false. If one of these is false in an AND statement, it returns false, as we see here. If both are true, our AND statement returns true. Right? And then for OR, we only need one of them to be true. So I do just just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions here. Sam, yes, sir.
Yeah, can you evaluate more than two values using the or the and?
That's a great question. You can. I recommend using parentheses. Let me just go ahead and comment these out. And let's construct a more complex example. Parentheses, make sure that whatever's inside the parentheses happen first. So let's say I have true or false and false. And I have a typo. I am missing the closing parentheses, which is part of the challenge with parentheses. Note, by the way, in the error message, it pointed to the line where it suspected the syntax error was, and it gave me the line number 93, and it told me the problem was at the end, and the red squiggly in VS Code confirmed. So this part of the error message is kind of going into the guts of JavaScript, and you can usually ignore, but this part is really important. And this usually is either at the top or the very bottom of the error message.
Yeah, but your error is actually colon, not semicolon.
Oh, that was, thank you. In fact, I might have had, oh yeah, I had it right. Thank you. That points out the other challenge of not jumping to conclusions like I just did, which is probably honestly the biggest challenge in debugging.
Well, that's all good.
Yeah. So now we've got this running. And so what's happening here is the order of operations, as it's called in math, is you evaluate the stuff inside parentheses first. So we're going to check if true or false is true. This evaluates the true. And then we have false here. So this ends up looking like this. Right? And now you can do multiple chaining without parentheses. Like you could do true and true and true and false. And this is going to end up as false because every single one of these has to be evaluated to false, and JavaScript evaluates them in order. Again, as your Boolean logic gets more complex, though, don't hesitate to use parentheses to help kind of organize the parts, if for no other reason than as a visual aid. There is one more thing related to Booleans that's really important in JavaScript to mention, and that is something called truthiness. So let's make a sort of odd comparison here with the number 1 in this Boolean logic or false. And what we see printed out here is the number 1. And what JavaScript is doing is it's returning whatever value is on the left here if it's truthy. And I'll talk a bit more in a sec about what that means, but I think an example will be worth 1,000 words. So here, instead of 1, we have the number 0, and JavaScript decided that 0 does not have a true-ish value, and it goes to the second part of the OR statement and it returns false. So truthy and falsy are about how JavaScript determines if something that's not a Boolean counts as true or false. So strings are truthy. Empty strings are falsy. Null and undefined are falsy. And this is a little weird. And on the one hand, it can make certain kinds of logic way easier to write. On the other hand, it can be a huge gotcha. So JavaScript has what's called truthiness and falsiness. And that's where it takes things that aren't Booleans and basically decides if they are the equivalent of true or false. And we call this truthy or falsy. And number values that are not 0 are truthy. Really 0 should count as truthy, but it does not in JavaScript, which can be a huge pain. Strings are falsy unless the string is an empty string, which is still a string, by the way. And if I add a bunch of spaces in here and we run this code again, if you guys look down here where there's this empty line, a space is a string value. So a string with a space counts as truthy, but an empty string is falsy. This is, in a nutshell, can be confusing and frustrating, but this is a big part of JavaScript and it's important to be aware of. So it's important just to be careful. When possible, try not to compare like non-Boolean values to Booleans. In practice, you will see truthiness and falsiness used all the time in JavaScript logic. The last thing I want to mention that is also a bit of a potential gotcha with JavaScript is how it compares things. So let's console log and say is 2 equal to 3. And this returns true if these two values are the same, and it returns false if they're different. And let me just comment that line out there. So 2 does not equal 3. It returns false. It's exactly what we would expect, right? And I can do this with other values as well. Like let's compare two strings and see if they're the same. And that returns true. Here is where it starts to get weird. This is an example of some old bad parts of JavaScript. Let's compare the string 2 to the number 2. Now,
False.
one would hope.
Oh.
It's actually true. It should not be true, but it is. Now, there is a solution here. Let me tell you all what is going on. When JavaScript was designed, the designer decided, probably because they only had 2 weeks, that they would try to be clever about what's called casting or changing the type of a variable. Because I might get user input and I might get the string value 2, and I might need to turn it into a number in my code. That's normal. That's called casting, like casting a spell, and programmers do it all the time. What's not normal is for the programming language to decide for you when to do it. And that's exactly what happens here, is that the programming language sees that this string happens to have a number value inside it, decides to cast it into a number, and then does the comparison. This is really bad. This is a huge source of difficult to find bugs. Thankfully, JavaScript has what's called strict comparison, where you use 3 equal signs instead of 2. And when you do strict comparison, it does not do this automatic casting. And if we look down here, we see false. for the strict comparison. And that's what we want. So the best practice in JavaScript is to never, ever, ever use double equals for comparison and to always use 3 equals for strict comparison. So never use double equals for comparison. Always use triple equals for comparison because you want it to be strict. Otherwise, you will quickly find that it introduces subtle, hard to find bugs that can be a little nightmarish. So I just want to pause here and see if folks have any questions, and then I think we'll take a break. Sam, yes, sir.
Yes, I was curious about falsy. Would undefined and an empty array also evaluate to falsy?
Great question. They do both evaluate to falsy. If we go ahead, we can in fact use, I believe it's, we'll just do, let's just do undefined or false, and we'll see it go to false, and we'll do, yeah, that's a great point. I believe an empty array goes to false. I'm not 100%. Let's run this and find out. And let me just go ahead and comment these guys out. So the empty array actually evaluates the truthy, which I actually was not sure about. Which makes sense. Undefined evaluates the falsy. Yeah, great question. All right, folks, why don't we take a short break? Let's take 5. And then we'll look at some of the more advanced data types with objects and arrays. Thank you all, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. All right, so we've been covering a lot of ground here, right? And just to recap a little bit, if we kind of scroll up here, we've talked about why JavaScript matters. We've talked about primitive data types. We're about to move on to complex data types, and we've already talked a bit about functions. We've learned that primitive data types are string, booleans, undefined, and null. We're going to learn about objects and arrays in just a moment. We didn't talk about it, but once you create a string, you can't really modify it. We saw how to interpolate strings with the backtick and the curly brackets and string manipulation. We saw that in JavaScript, everything uses the number type, and that there's the math library for common things we want to do with numbers, like rounding them down or squaring them. We learned the joys of Booleans. I do want to point out with Booleans and comparisons, I didn't really demonstrate number comparisons, so I do want to show that real quick. If I want to check if 5 is greater than 4, this returns a Boolean value of true or false, right? 5 is greater than 4, so it'll return true. If I want to check if 3.3 is less than or equal to 3.431, this is less than or equal to, right? Similarly, I could do greater than or equal to, and 3.3 is indeed less than 3.31, so this would return true. It's not greater than or equal to 3.31, so this would return false. We don't need a second equal sign here. This is fine all by itself. So for these kind of number comparisons, you can just write them like this. So I did want to touch on that, just to make that clear. And then we saw the joys of the strict comparisons and truthy and falsy, right? And that's sort of the big difference between JavaScript and other languages. Let's talk about arrays. And now we're starting to get into what's called a complex data structure. So an array is a list of values that's in order. And it can be any kind of value or variable that we want. such as strings representing days of the week. And I would put for an array the semicolon at the end. To create an array, I use square brackets, not curly brackets. And it's very similar to a Python list for those who might be familiar with those. Sometimes you'll see an array written like this. If it gets really big, you might see it on multiple lines like this. It depends a little bit on personal preference and just how big the array is. The goal is you don't want it to kind of stretch too far across the screen. So once I have an array, we call each of these an element in the array. And let me pull up my annotator here so we can do a little drawing. So this is an element and so on. So we have 5 items or elements in the array, right? And the big thing about an array is it knows what order these are in. And when we want to grab or use one of these items in the array, it's called accessing an element in the array. And we do it by what's called the index of the array, which is the position. Now, with computers, everything is ones and zeros. It's binary, right? So when we're counting in an array, we start with 0. So this array has 5 items in it. Its length is 5, but in terms of counting, we start at the 0 index, right? And so just as an example, let's print out the array just so we can see it. And let's also print out its length. And in JavaScript, the way we do this is with something called dot notation with complex objects like arrays and, well, objects with complex data structures. They have different properties, and it could be a function, it could be a value. We'll learn a bit more about this later, but the way we access these is with a dot. And you can see with this autocomplete, there's different functions I could run to do things to my array. I can also access certain values that JavaScript sort of computes for me. And one of these is the length of the array. And let's go ahead and just print that out with a little string interpolation. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we got. All right, so we see that the length of the array is 5. But again, when we're going to access items in the array, we have to start counting at 0. And this is called 0 indexed. And pretty much every programming language works this way. So if I want to grab the first thing in the array, I do my days sub 0. Sub is the term that's used to indicate we're grabbing the thing at index 0. I could also do it this way. Let's grab the second thing in the array and let's print that out. And let's go ahead and run this code. Right? And so again, we see the array printed, we see its length, we see the first thing that we grab at the 0 index and the second thing at the first index. And pretty much everything in programming is 0 indexed. So this is important to get used to. And it is can be a point of confusion. The way to talk about it is like index 0 or position 0, and the stuff inside an array we call items or elements. So each of these strings is an item or an element inside the array. And let's just play around a little bit more with arrays. And let me do a little clearing of these console logs. So an array doesn't just have to be all the same type. I could put a Boolean value in it. I could put a number in it. I can put null in it. I'm not sure if I can put undefined in it. You can, you wouldn't want to. I can put a variable in it. I can put a message in it. Right, so you can mix up the kind of stuff in an array. You generally want to keep it consistent, but you can do it however you want.
Can you put a function in an array?
You actually can, though we're going to get there in a little bit.
Alright,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's a little bit more advanced, but it's a great question. So I want to grab, let's print out the value of this first, second, third, fourth, fifth item in the array, foo. So it's the fifth item, but I start at 0, so it should be index 4, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's go ahead and print that out just for fun. And there we go. Now, what's even more fun is you can put an array inside an array. So I might want to have an array of names. And so I have an array of 2 items, but each item happens to be its own array. And in this situation, I might want to put my items on separate lines to make it easier to read. And when you're listing stuff, it's pretty common in JavaScript to put a comma here at the end, what's called a trailing comma. And the reason is if I don't and I add something and then forget a comma, it will throw an error, as we're about to see here when I run this code. I'm a little surprised that we didn't get an error. We should have gotten an error. When we run this, maybe when we print it out, we'll get our error. We got something even worse than an error, what's called a silent error, which actually I had not expected. Note that there was no error message. The code ran to completion, right? It didn't hit here, throw an error and stop, but the behavior of the code is not what we want at all. This is undefined and we don't have this third value. This is actually the worst kind of error you can have. Error messages are actually your best friend because you know something's wrong and you have a clue as to why. This kind of silent error is really easy to miss and can be really hard to debug. So you want to avoid it at all costs. If I add in that missing comma and we run this again, we see now what we expect. And so because it's so easy to forget this comma here, it's just a good habit to always, when you're listing stuff out in JavaScript, add a comma at the end, because now if I want to add something new, the comma's already there. So I have this array of arrays. So far, so good. How do I actually deal with the stuff inside of it, though? Well, there's 2 ways. One is I could grab the second thing in there. And maybe I want to print the last name of that person. Let's just call this a name. Really, these are chefs, so we should call them chefs' names. And this should print the last name of the second person in the array. So 0, 1, our second person, and the second item. So we should see Keller printed to the screen if I add my missing parentheses. And we do indeed. There is a more succinct way of doing this. So when you do this, it's kind of like a baby function, right? It returns a value that gets assigned to this variable, and it's returning this value right here. And you can sort of chain these operations together. So I can do console.log my names sub1 to get that first name. And then right here, this is returning that value here, and I know it's an array. So I can tell JavaScript, just go ahead and grab the second item there. Or actually, let's grab their first name this time. And so now we should see Thomas. And indeed we do. And this is really common as data structures and code gets more complex. So this is a really important pattern to get familiar with. That said, sometimes when you're debugging or just to get started, if it's easier to do it this way, I totally recommend it. They both accomplish the same task and they're both very easy to read. And at the end of the day, that's what matters the most. There are a lot of different methods that arrays have. You can combine things, you can concatenate things, and you can also see if something is inside an array. So let's do my array dot includes, and this is a function or method that we're going to call on this specific array. And it's going to actually go through all the elements in the array and check if inside there is the value of this string, it's sunny, which indeed there is and which should return true. And we see true right here. There are a lot of array methods. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but I do want to point out just a couple so we can see. One is called concatenate, and you can use it to combine two different arrays, right? We have an array here and an array here. And I take this array, I call this concat method on it. I pass in the second array as an argument, and it actually returns a new array. And let's actually run this in our code because there is something important here that I do want to point out. So let me go ahead and comment this stuff out. And let's paste that in. And let's console log array 3. And let's console log array 1. Right? So again, concatenate combines these two arrays. So what I want to point out here is concatenate creates a brand new array, array 3. It does not modify array 1. Right? And that touches on like an important concept of if a complex data structure is modified in place or if a new value is created. And some things might modify something in place, and for others, a new value is created. And let's just explore this a little more, and then we'll move on. So I could make an empty array. Let's just call this new array, and it's empty. And because this is a const, you would think that I can't add anything to this array. This is where complex data types in JavaScript start to get different. I can use this operation. Let me make sure I have it right. And actually, I apologize, my brain, there we go. That's the command I was looking for. So I can use the command or the method push to add an item into my array. And now if I run my code, we see there's something in the array. Even though this is a const, and in theory, we shouldn't be able to change it, I can add a lot of things in here. And I can use a different operation called pop. And that gets rid of the last thing in an array, right? Because an array knows its own order. And let me go ahead and run this code and we can see it and discuss. And so here we see we've added those elements into the array, and then this has popped the last one out for us. There's a lot of other operations we can do with arrays, things like slicing to get certain elements of it. And we'll see those as we get into different assignments, but I don't want to go too deep into every method right now, just because we're doing a more general overview. So I might talk a little bit about slicing. So push is good to know. There's another shorthand for doing it, which I apologize is escaping me at the moment. Pop is good to know. Let's talk a little bit about why we can do this with an array, even though it's a const. And let's look at the type of our array and see what type of variable it is. So this is interesting. We call it an array, but under the hood, it's an object type. And this kind of points to one of the design principles of JavaScript. Pretty much everything that's not a primitive data type in JavaScript is actually an object under the hood. So we call it an array and it behaves like an array or similar to a Python list. Under the hood, it's an object. And so from JavaScript's perspective, we've created an object in memory and the object is still there and it's the same object. We're just modifying what's inside of it. And so it's sort of like if you have a container, and let me pull up our annotator. And let's actually just draw a diagram like this. And let's say that this is our computer memory. And memory is sort of organized by addresses. And so this might be address like XY123, and they're organized in order. So over here we have XY124, and over here we have memory address XY125. And under the hood, this is what pretty much every programming language is doing. And when I add a primitive value in here, like say 5, or let's say maybe false, that value goes right in there, right? But when I have an array, I have, let's call it new array. And when I'm working with these primitive values, I'm actually using the value itself when I'm modifying it. When I'm working with these more complex data types, I'm actually working with what's called like the pointer or the reference to it. And so from JavaScript's perspective, this new array, it's kind of, it hasn't changed and everything is still here inside the same container. And this is called pass by reference versus pass by value. And I think I'll dig into it a bit more in a minute when we can explore it maybe with a function and an array. So I just wanted to talk about this a little bit. And let's actually do a quick demonstration of this and then we'll move on. So let's make a variable and we'll just call it bar. And let's make a quick function and let's have it add stuff. And it's going to take in like some sort of value. And it's going to add 3 to that value, and then it's going to print it. So let's go ahead and let's run add stuff and pass in our variable bar. And let's go ahead and print out bar once we're done. And let's see what happens. So, and my apologies, let's ignore these over here. But over here, we would see kind of what we expect. We created bar on line 174, its value is 5. On line 181, we run our add stuff function. We pass in bar as an argument. We add 3 to it. We get 8. We print that value out. We see that here. The function is executed. The flow of execution moves to line 182. And we print out bar. And bar is still 5. Right? So this variable bar has actually not changed. And what's happened is when we call this function, JavaScript didn't pass in the reference to where this variable lives in memory. We're not actually changing bar. It passes in the value. It passed in 5. Right? So this is called pass by value, and it happens mainly for primitive data types. Bar is unchanged. And let me go ahead and let's comment out these console logs here. And let's take our new array that we created up here. Right? And just for fun, let's print it out. And let's write a function like add to array. And we're going to take the array that we pass in as an argument, and we're going to add to it this string, this very long sentence. And then let's console log the array. And let's go ahead and let's run this method. And let's pass in my array as an argument. And then let's console log new array. And let's see what happens. And let me go ahead and clear the terminal. And let's run this. Let's see here. I may have done something wrong because we have, let's see. Oh, new array is hello and goodbye. Oh, I apologize. I'm passing in the wrong value. This is the danger of variable names that are too similar. Over here, I'm passing in my array, and I've been using the name new array. So let's try to be a little more consistent, and hopefully that resolves the issue. And as a good object lesson, and a good habit is name variables in ways that are hard to get wrong. And this is actually what I was expecting to see. So on line 185, we print new array, and we see this right here, and it just has the strings hello and goodbye. This function is declared, but it doesn't run, right? A function only actually gets executed when we call it. So we go from here, JavaScript reads this function but doesn't run it. It goes to line 192, and now it executes the function. It passes a new array as an argument. It adds this item to the end of the array, and it prints it out. And we see what we would expect from that, which is we now have a third item in our array. It's printed out. The function finishes executing. The flow of execution continues to 193. And this is where it gets interesting, because unlike the bar variable that just had the integer 5, this new array indeed is modified. So we did not pass the value of the array in here. We passed in the reference to where the array lives in memory. And so in JavaScript with complex data types like arrays and objects, it does what's called pass by reference. We're passing the reference to the item in memory, and then we actually modify the array. So let me pause here and check in for questions because I've covered a good amount of ground and I want to see what's on people's minds. Rick, yes, sir.
Yeah, so this comes from my C++ course that I took. And I was kind of curious about JavaScript because it is also very similar to C++, but whenever you say pop and push, in C++, that's called creating a stack. Is the algorithms like that, is that how it works in JavaScript as well?
That's a great question. We're going to look at the stack data structure later on in the course. The short answer is a JavaScript array kind of is a Swiss Army knife, and it includes all the same behavior as a stack, including pop and push. And that's why you see those there.
Yeah, because I noticed there's other ones that you can use as well, not just pop and push, but you can pull something from the front or all kinds of stuff you can do.
Yeah.
So, all right.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, a JavaScript array is a little misnamed. In computer science, the array data structure is much more limited. In JavaScript, what we call an array does a lot more and is much more similar to a Python list. Tony, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just wondering on the pass by value. So if you were to take that, I don't remember what the array was called, but your bar, I guess, up at the top, not the array, the variable. So if you were to in the function put bar equals x plus 3, would that be considered pass by reference?
That's a great question. You mean if I do this? Yeah. So if I do this, something else is actually happening here. Note that we're not actually passing bar into the function at all. This is a different behavior of the programming language. It's called a closure. I don't want to get into it now, but in essence, if we do this, when JavaScript looks at this function, it says, oh, there's this variable here, but it isn't declared inside this function, inside the scope of this function. Let me look a level up outside of the function to see if there's a variable and bring it in. So we can do this, and closures are a big part of JavaScript, but that's different than passing it in as an argument to the function. Yeah, great question. Tony, yes, sir. Or sorry, Tom, yes, sir.
Yeah, so when we pass something into a function via an argument, I notice that we don't have to declare it. So is that an example of pass by reference? Is that why we don't have to redeclare like x inside of the function?
Sort of. That's a great point. When we define a function and we define these arguments or parameters under the hood, JavaScript basically creates a variable and probably makes it undefined. And then when we actually call it, it sets the value. So under the hood, JavaScript is creating a variable for us. That's a bit different than pass by reference or pass by value, though. Like JavaScript, it's more a question of what does that variable hold? Does it hold the value 5, or does it hold? It's like an address book with phone numbers, right? If I'm looking up the address book, do I get like the actual phone number or like the page in the address book where I can find the phone number?
So does it basically just hold a pointer?
Pass by reference holds pointers, yes.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Rick, yes, sir. And then I do want to move on. Oh, perfect. No worries. Awesome. So again, we've actually gone like pretty deep into some sort of programming language and computer science fundamentals. You will run into this as time goes on. Right now, I think the main thing is simply to be aware of it. The last thing I want to point out is I can take an array and I can access any element in it and I can change its value. Right? So this is an easy way to modify a value in an array. And if we look at this third print statement here, we see that the 0th element in the array, the first thing in it has been changed to the string foo. And let me go ahead and do a little commenting out of console logs. And now let's talk about objects. And arrays and objects are going to be your bread and butter in JavaScript. You're going to be using them a lot. So again, we've gone a bit deep right now into arrays and pass by reference versus pass by value, but it is really valuable stuff that we'll see popping up. And as you start to write more and more code, it starts to become more intuitive. So objects are sort of the bread and butter of JavaScript. It's two curly brackets together like this. This actually makes what's called an empty object. And if I console log it, we'll see that it's going to print out just sort of a representation of an object that has nothing in it. In fact, we see nothing. But if we do type of, and I should add a semicolon here just to be completionist, we're going to see that the type of our object is an object. Objects are really good to hold collections of related information. For instance, if I have information about a car, I would add the different information as different properties on the object. And this is similar to a dictionary in Python, for those who may have seen that. And the syntax to add properties to an object looks like this. I have a key, I have a colon, and then I have a value. And the value can be anything at all. The key, if it's just I'm using sort of a string as a key, I can just type it like this without single or double quotes. If I want, I can use single quotes. This can be useful in certain situations. But most of the time for bread and butter objects, we're defining keys like this. And let's just make a variable for fun. And it's going to be the mileage of my car, and it's going to have 217,000 miles. And the mileage will be my car mileage. So you can have a value be a variable as well. And note that when I forgot that comma there, I saw that print squiggly. And you usually see objects written like this as they get big. You can have everything on one line, but as you can see, it gets a little unwieldy if you have a lot of properties. And it's pretty common to have objects with lots of properties. And now let's go ahead and let's console log our object and see what it looks like. And so now we see, I'm not sure where that undefined came from. Now we see, oh, because I renamed it. That's why, because my object no longer exists. And I renamed it to car object. And so we see that when we print it out, we see all the different properties on the object. Now, if I want to deal with just one property on an object, I use what's called dot notation, and it's called accessing an object property. So I can maybe, in fact, why don't we write a function that says, like, let's call it get car summary, and we'll pass in a car. as an object, and we'll return a string, and we'll use string interpolation, and we'll say the color is car dot color, and we'll say the make is car dot make, and the mileage is car dot mileage. And I could do all this by hand. I could do console log car obj dot model, and when I run this, we'll see printed out here the value of this model property. So we should see focus. And indeed we do. But what's really common is, just like with arrays, we're passing objects as arguments to different functions. So let's pass that car object into this function. It should return a string describing the car, and then we'll print that out. And this is common too, where you have the output of one function getting fed in as the input to another. And so now I have a really handy dandy function that I can use to get summaries of different objects. So, and again, just like with arrays, we are not like copying this object and passing in the value. We're passing in what's called a pointer, or a reference to where the object itself lives in memory. And so under the hood, JavaScript is doing let car equals, car obj or whatever here. And inside here, if I do car dot foo equals, hello, and let's in fact console log the car object, we'll see indeed that the object itself has been modified. Right, and we see that this foo property that was added here to the object is on the object itself, that we passed in a reference to where this object lives. In general, you want to be careful about doing stuff like this inside functions. It can get a little tricky. And in general, with functions, you want one function to do one job. So if I wanted to modify an object, I would probably write a different function to do it. I do want to point out another way to access properties on an object. We grabbed it here by model, but I could also do console.log car obj, and instead of that dot notation, if I use brackets and I put in the key as a string value, it will print that out. And so I should now see the color of the car. And indeed, we see that. And this actually is useful because maybe instead of a string hard-coded in here, I have some sort of variable. So once we get into looping and stuff, this can be a really powerful tool to like write code that will like go through maybe sort of dynamically accessing properties on an object. Objects can get pretty complex. I might have a bunch of different cars. Maybe I have a database of car objects, and I'm going to keep it really simple. Object keys don't have to just be strings. They can also be numbers. And so you can have nesting in objects. And I don't know, let's make like a Toyota. Yes. Now, if my key is a number, I can't use the dot notation. I have to do something like this. And then this should print out the second thing in there. And this is pretty common too, where you start to see objects get more complex and nested. You can even have arrays inside here. Like that. Right, and let's just demonstrate that here. So potentially my logic for accessing things starts to get more complex. Right? Where I'm kind of chaining these things on top of each other. And this syntax can be pretty dense starting out, but when you get used to it, it becomes really powerful and second nature. And it just comes with practice and time, I think. So let's see. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about arrays. We've gone into objects. We've talked a bit. We already talked a bit about functions, but it does bear repeating. The idea of a function is you have inputs, right? And the function does something and then has an output. And that's really what we've seen as we've written functions. Cricket, yes, sir.
So, when you type console.log db2, and then can you put 0? So what's gonna be the result?
Yeah, good question. So if I look at this object, and remember, this looks similar to array notation, but in this case, we're not accessing elements in an array. We're grabbing a property on an object. This cars DB only has keys 1 and 2. And so if we do, let's go ahead and do 0. We're going to get probably undefined or some sort of error because it doesn't exist. And let's go ahead and run this. And that's actually, I think, good for us to see. And indeed, we see undefined, right? And that raises a good point. Like, I could do this for all sorts of things. Like, here's another object property that doesn't exist. Right? This cars DB object doesn't have a property named foobar. So this does not cause an error in JavaScript, but it does return undefined. Arnold, yes, sir.
So you're basically going by name.
Correct. Yeah, the key is the name, right? And there's different, if the key happens to be a number, which you probably should avoid most of the time with objects, to be honest. But sometimes it makes sense, then you need to use the bracket notation way of getting an object property or name. But if it's, if it's not a number, you can do dot notation. Like I could do this way and we'd get the same results. Because we're looking for the property on here, right? And that, or the key value, and that doesn't exist. Yeah, so it's basically by name. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, good question, guys. And that's a great point to raise, Cricket. Rick, yes, sir.
Yeah, this is where I kind of started getting lost in the pre-work is the objects. But is there a way, I know there's a way, but so you got your object, you have all your models, makes and all that. And say you want to print just all the models in the parking lot. So it's like, I don't care about the make, the year, the features, just print out model for every single object. Is, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
Would
We're
that
gonna
be
get.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, is that like using a loop iteration to go through everything in the object, or objects don't really work in loops?
No, we would do some sort of loop. That would be the way to do it. There's a couple methods out there for doing it. There's something called object.keys. And let's run this and see what we get. So this gives me the different key values of all the properties on this object. Right, focus and graph or something else. So I could get the keys and then use that in a loop. There is also a way, I think, to turn, let's see, it might be object properties. No, let me double check here. Turn object into array. There we go. Object dot values. That's what I was looking for. Now, the challenge with both of these is you don't have a strong guarantee about the order of things. So if that matters, you have to handle it a little differently. But we can see here that object dot values, and by the way, the original object itself is still just fine, right? If we print that out, and let's have a little more space here in the terminal. So the object itself is still fine. It's still an object, but we can see object.keys will return the different keys of the object properties. So if I want to use those to loop through and then grab them in my code, I can do that. Or if I just want to go ahead and turn each property in my object into an array, I can do that as well. And I can do that with object.values. So there are a couple options, and then we would use some sort of loop. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Let's actually, I want to talk a little bit. We should probably take a short break. I know we're getting a little close to time here. I want to talk a little bit about if-else statements, and then we will dive into loops, and that will really kind of take us to the wrapping point for the bulk of what we want to cover today. And when we get to loops, we'll see there's like a number of ways to interact with objects. So let's go ahead and let's take 5, and then when we come back, we'll look at some if-else logic, and we'll get into looping. Thank you guys, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. All right, we've done a pretty deep dive into objects. And there was a great question during the break of, hey, if I want to get both the key and the value of an object property, is there a way for me to do that? And indeed there is. There's something called object.entries. And what this is going to do is it's going to actually turn this stuff into an array. So I will end up with an array, and inside that, I'll have a nested array where the first item is a key, the object key, and the other is a value. So for our cars DB, it's going to look something like this. Where the keys to these properties are 1 and 2, right? And then the values are these objects. So let's run this and see what that looks like. And let me give us a little more real estate here. And we see that this object.entries method. So by the way, when you see stuff with a capital letter like this, it's sort of like basically a built-in library in JavaScript. It's actually a special kind of object under the hood. It's sort of like a class in another language, but not really. And you use it for sort of utility methods. So the idea here is if I want to take a specific object and break it down in this way where I can get an array, of arrays where I have the key of and then the value of each property, I use this object.entries. And again, W3 schools or the MDN docs are a good way to go. So object.entries will give me this array. And again, this makes a copy. My original object is unmodified. So this is very useful. And we'll see this stuff come back in a little bit when we get into looping. I want to talk a little bit about if and else statements, and then we'll get into iteration and looping and all the different kinds of looping and all that good stuff. So this is if else statements. You'll also hear this called conditional logic, as in like, is it condition A? Is it condition B? You know, if A, do this, if B, do that. And we're going to look at something called ternary operators, which are sort of a shorthand. So I think a lot of us have seen your classic sort of if statement. Like I might have an age. I might create a variable. And I want to figure out if someone is, 21 in the United States, they can drink. If they're less than 21, they can't. And I might write an if statement that looks something like this. If less than 21, you're not old enough to drink. Else, yes, you are. And if I console log can drink, we'll see this. This will be yes, because our person is 24 years old. Now, in JavaScript, you can have, this is really sort of the formal way to write this. And I would maybe recommend getting used to this. I think this way is a little simpler and cleaner. It does the exact same thing. By not having the else on the same line, you avoid typos. As you get more comfortable, you can shift styles if you want. As things get more complicated, our conditional logic can get more complicated as well. And let's add an A there for USA. Right. And so what's happening is all of this gets evaluated for truthiness or falsiness. So this has to be true, and this has to be true to go into here and execute this logic. Otherwise, we go here. But if I change this right to, I think the country code for Germany is DE for Deutschland. I'm not sure though. And did I get something wrong? I've forgotten some parentheses to make sure the logic gets operated in the right order. Let's see if we get the expected answer now. And I think I have some sort of, oh, I apologize. I kind of have my logic backwards. And the order of the logic matters, in fact. So let's undo some of this, and I'll rewrite this one more time just so we can see. This is not quite about if else statements, but it does point out the importance of the order that things happen in. So let's see if this works now. If the country is USA and they're less than 21, then they can't drink. If the country is not USA, it goes here. So we're going to see yes. I think I just had my logic backwards because we're always, let's see here. Let's change this to like 19 and see if this works. I may have gotten a little lost in the sauce. There we go. That's what I wanted to see. So now, if we live in the United States and we're not old enough, we shouldn't be able to drink. That's what I want to see. So I got my logic a little confused here, which as you can see is pretty easy just to walk through it. If we're in the US and we're under 21, we can't drink, which indeed is what happens when I run the code. Otherwise, we can. I realize this is a very simplified example. If we're in a different country where we're just going to assume the legal age to drink is higher. So we're no longer in the US. This is false because this is an and statement. If either of these is false, the whole statement evaluates to false. So in this case, we skip right over this and we go to the else, and then we go to can drink equals yes. I see a couple questions. I do want to take them. I do want to make sure we have enough time to tackle other stuff. Tom, yes, sir.
Yeah, real quick. Switch statements, similar to if else, have those been phased out or are they still used sometimes?
They're still used. We're not going to cover them today though.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Arnold, yes, sir.
Yeah, so how did you determine which one has to go first and which one goes second?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is it depends on what you want your program to do. Right. And in this case, this actually is not a very good algorithm because I'm not like checking the drinking age of other countries or stuff like that. As you all saw when I kind of made my error, the order that this stuff matters in. So really the only way to do it is to, you know, talk through and have an understanding of what you want your logic to be. Because it just depends on what you're trying to have the program accomplish. There's probably a nicer way to write this, but the order matters and it's just going to depend on the specific situation. I do want to show, let's see here, and let me go ahead and comment this out. So that's an if else. I do want to show something called a ternary operator, which is sort of a shorthand. And so if I kind of want to condense some of this logic, it's not going to be quite the same, but it's going to be close. I'm going to set the value of the can drink variable. I'm going to put what I would normally put inside my if statement here on the left. I'm going to put a question mark. And if this evaluates to true, we'll return this value. And then here on the other side of the colon, we'll have if this evaluates to false. So this is equivalent to the simpler version of my code. So this and this ternary do the exact same thing. And what we're saying here is if age is less than 21, then return too young, else return legal drinking age. And this is called a ternary statement. And it's basically a shorthand, right? And we see it illustrated in this diagram over here where I'm evaluating a condition. If that condition is true, we do whatever's in the first code block. If it's false, we do whatever's in the second code block. You don't worry about using this too much right now. I just want you all to see it so you know it's there. These both do the same thing, right? So especially if JavaScript is new to you, just start with if-else statements and you can always add them to ternaries over time. The one thing that's important with ternaries is to keep it simple. Don't get too complicated. If you like nesting stuff in your ternaries, it's too complicated and you should probably put it in like an if statement. Alex, yes, sir.
What's the question mark indicating?
So the question mark is basically saying, it's like the same way we have this stuff inside the parentheses here on the if statement. That's what's on the left of the question mark. And then on the right is our two possible return
Instructions.
values. Yeah,
Got it.
good question. Good question. Tony, yes, sir.
So I know you said we don't need to get caught up on it too much now, but as far as like industry, do they prefer the ternaries when they can be used, or is it more if else?
That's a great question. If it's simple and it's a one-liner, use a ternary. If you have to think about it, use an if else. Because what the industry really cares about is simplicity and readability. The ternary is great for simple stuff, right? But if your logic is starting to get complex and it's kind of hard, then switch to an if else, right? Because if I have to debug a super complex one-line ternary statement, how do I do that without potentially introducing more errors? Yeah, great question. We'll see the ternary a lot later in the course in React, but again, the rule is keep it simple. Awesome. So that's kind of if else statements. There's a little bit more you can do with this. There's an else if. I think there's a broad familiarity with that, so I want to dive into looping. And then I think that'll take us really to the end of this part of the lecture. So looping, everyone's favorite thing. There are a lot of different ways to loop through stuff in JavaScript. You have your classic for loop. And in fact, let's maybe do something like this. We'll have an abbreviation. And we'll have, I think, an array of objects. I'm not going to do all the days of the week, just in the interests of time. We'll just do maybe like the first 3 days. And let's add Wednesday here. So I might have an array of objects, and your classic for loop looks something like this. Where I'm basically creating a temporary index variable named I, and then I want to do stuff with whatever I'm looping through. So, I might let b equal days sub I, and then let's print day name d dot name abbreviation d dot abbreviation. And if I run my code, we should see this loop through pretty nicely. For a long time, this was the only way to do a loop in JavaScript. This is important if I need that index value. Maybe I want to have something like let day num equal I plus 1. Maybe I need that index value for some important information. Right? So this is the ordering of the days of the week that I can kind of extract based on the ordering of the items in my list. But if I don't care about that, and all I need are the abbreviations, JavaScript has a newer way of looping that's called sort of, I believe it's let of, and you can write it like this. It's for, and then again, in the parentheses, we say let d for day of our array of days. And if all I need is the abbreviations of each day, I could do something like this. And so this is much simpler, right? I don't need to create a counter or, a index pointer variable that I increment. There's less typos to make. It's much cleaner to read and easier. So this way is preferred. Sometimes you do need an index, so this, isn't going anywhere, but this is the preferred way to do it. There's a couple other ways to loop as well. And in fact, let's grab this link and take a quick look at it. Excuse me. When I learned JavaScript, these things didn't exist, so I am less used to them. This one's really good for going through the properties in an object, like we can see here. So we might want to, going back to using our cars, or let's just make a new object here. Let's just call it days object. And maybe my object looks like this. Right. And a big thing in programming is there's a lot of different ways to organize your data. Depending on what you want to do, sometimes you want to organize it with an array of stuff. Sometimes maybe you want an object. And let's see if I got my logic right here for this let in loop. And indeed we do. Let me comment this one out so we can just see the new one running. And we see here that we get just the key, right? I don't actually get the value. So I would have some extra work to do. So there's a number of ways to play around with this. I think one of the best ways to work with looping through an object is object entries, which we briefly saw earlier. And so it might look something like this. And entry is an array of key and value. Right, so let's just console log entry and see what that looks like. What did we miss here? So we have days obs, we have entry.
But you need two values there. Since you have,
Yeah, you're correct. I apologize. Yeah, this is a little more advanced. This is something that we're going to learn about in a little bit called destructuring, and I'll show the simpler version. Excellent point. I think that was Tom. Thank you. So object.entries, it returns an array with two items, but I only declared one variable there, and I didn't tell JavaScript it was an array, so it did not like that. Another way to do this that doesn't involve the destructuring, which we'll dive into a bit more in a bit, is maybe we have, we're going to convert our days object using object.entries. And if we print that out, we'll see, just to remind us what that gives us. And let me comment this out for now. Right, it takes our object, it takes the key and the value and turns it into an array where the first item is the key and the second is the value. So we have a nested array of keys and values. Each of these is an entry, right? And once I have that, then I can use like a for of loop. And I could do something like this. Right, and that will give me key, and that will give me the value. And then we see it kind of printed out the way we would expect down here, where we see the key value. As you can see, destructuring, which basically lets us kind of combine some of this variable creation work into one line, is much more succinct, but the syntax gets a little more complicated. So I think this is the important starting point, getting comfortable with object.entries, and then using this for of construct to loop through an array. There are a couple other kinds of looping. I think the last one to show real quick is a while loop. They have their place. Right? This is sort of the classic scenario of a while loop. And we're going to basically increase z each time we go through the while loop. And then this keeps looping until this evaluates to false, right? So we got from 0 to 9. While loops are really good for like user interface loops and things where it might go on an indefinite amount of time. Like I don't know how long the user is gonna use my command line program until they want to quit. The danger is if instead of like increasing z by 1, I made a programmer error and decreased it, I can end up in an infinite loop. Right? Z will never become equal to 10. This is always true. It never becomes false, and it just loops forever. I try to avoid while loops unless I really need them, because it's a lot easier to make some sort of programmer error and introduce an infinite loop in a while loop. It's all much harder to do that in a for loop, much harder. Different people will have different opinions. Mine is if you need a while loop, use it. If you don't specifically need a while loop, avoid it. All right, we have covered a lot of ground, folks. This is awesome. We are a bit past time, so let's pause here and let's talk about the afternoon. And this is really the end of part 1, right? We did a pretty deep dive. We looked at primitive data types. We've looked a lot at objects and arrays. And as you can see, those are really the bread and butter of JavaScript. We've done a pretty good amount working with functions, and a little bit of ternary logic, and then iteration. We did already cover some truthy and falsy. In the next lesson, we'll see another way of writing functions called an arrow function. We'll see some more sophisticated ways to sort of iterate and loop through collections of things like in arrays in JavaScript, sort of in a functional style with map and filter, and some object destructuring. And then after that, part 3 is going to be testing with Jest. So thank you all very much. And I'm excited for us to dive into this.